Welcome to the Secret to Seeker podcast. I'm your host Simeon, and I bring you conversations with some of the world's most insightful and inspiring seekers. Today's guest is Imogen Sita, and right off the bat I should tell you, this is one of the most insightful conversations I've had on this channel. What sets Imogen apart, I believe, is her holistic, integrated vision of life. The depth of her understanding and compassion for life's different and often contrasting aspects. This allowed us to delve right into some of the more difficult elements of self-discovery. What I mean here is that now it's trending to speak about positive psychology and positive thinking, the law of attraction and such. And while all these have their value, I believe it is equally important to become intimate with the darker aspects of ourselves and the world. To integrate our personal and collective shadow, as Carl Jung would put it. As I have discovered in my personal experience, it is through facing that within us which we deem unworthy, shameful, even evil, that we gain a level of humility, compassion and integrity that is otherwise just impossible to acquire. So here comes a conversation where Imogen and I speak at length about the shadow and the journey of embracing it. We talk about the nature of awakening and also about the role of relationships, intimate and otherwise, on the spiritual journey. So, without spoiling it any further, I bring you my conversation with Imogen. I hope it brings you as much peace and insight as it brought me. Enjoy. I wanted to ask you about, you've spoken before about your path, of how you started in the TM movement and then going through some really tough hardship and then going through different personal crises which led you to greater understanding. But recently I've been thinking more and more about this, essentially the existence of suffering, because I've discovered that me doing personal work or spiritual work, or however you would call it, it feels sometimes it's easy to feel like the closer you are to God, the more peaceful and loving and calm and happy you're supposed to be. But then I find that sometimes I feel closest to that, whatever it is, however you'd like to call it, that ultimate ground in reality, when I experience profound suffering. And recently I've had my small share of, facing it, encountering it in my personal life. And this kind of made me wonder about your take on suffering, because you've really gone through some deep suffering, and I wanted to hear your perspective on it, because I'm not quite so sure that growing means abolishing suffering, and that suffering is something you should kind of sweep away.
No, I don't think suffering is something you can sweep away either. I think that's a nice idea, but it's something that we all experience. I actually want to define what I think of as suffering, maybe to answer your question a little better, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding maybe about what people are talking about, because we all have ideas about what words mean, because they're conceptual. They can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. For me, suffering comes in with the non-acceptance of what is. So this is where I suffered in life, for instance, is when there was a lot of non-acceptance of various emotional and physical states that were happening in my experience, situations, interactions, relationships, whatever it might be. So I don't feel that you necessarily have to suffer that, but you have to experience it. And that's the difference I want to point out, is like, I suffered them because I didn't want to experience them. And when I allowed myself to fully meet everything that was arising in me, I wouldn't necessarily call that suffering anymore, because there was a full acceptance of what was arising in me. Now, was it pleasant? Was it happy necessarily? No, not at all. But at some point there was a recognition of, I'm not actually suffering this in the way that I once was. So that's why I want to make the distinction, maybe, is like we can intimately feel all aspects of our life, and that's not just the good stuff, it's the bad stuff too. In fact, I would even like sort of do away with both of those labels and call life as an intensity, different forms of intensity, different flavors of intensity. As to whether we need to suffer them, this I think is a question mark, and I think this is more to do with whether we have the capacity to meet each moment in the present moment, rather than running away from that and feeling like we have to run away from that.
Yeah, yeah. I agree with, yeah, I've also been conceptualizing suffering as essentially resistance to what is. And then I've been reminded of, the Buddha's idea, which was actually such a revolutionary idea, just, the first base noble truth was, living is suffering. And then he says, living is suffering. There's a way to overcome suffering, and this is the way. And his way is, sometimes people simplify it as abolish desire, but I think what the Buddha meant by desire is this expectation of life that life doesn't meet. And then this is the kind of the resistance. So this can both be negative, as in I'm so unhappy, or this can be positive as I want that.
And you can, for me, it's the attachment to that. Like for me, I have no fear or worry of desire arising, but there's an acknowledgement of that desire can either be fulfilled or not, and it's actually in many ways out of my hands, and there's no attachment to that. There's no expectation of that being fulfilled or not fulfilled, depending on whether it's a positive or a negative desire in there. But yeah, to me, it's the attachment. It's the need for something to be fulfilled, or the need for something to not be fulfilled, is where you get into that suffering. But even resistance, you bring up resistance there. For me, even resistance, the appearance of resistance, even that can be accepted and therefore not suffered.
Mm-hmm.
So even that doesn't need to be gotten rid of in its way. It can be transcended and included into the space of this moment. I think resistance is something people get hung up on a little bit, of feeling like, oh, I need to get rid of my resistance to uncover the thing that is true in this moment. I'm resisting something, and I need to get rid of that resistance first before I can sort of delve into that thing. And to me, it's like, no, include the resistance too.
Yeah. So there's always this, so however many layers you have of experience of, let's say, something unpleasant happens and you have a resistance to it, there's still always this layer beneath, which is the layer of kind of unhooking yourself from identifying with this resistance and just accepting it for what it is. Yeah.
Being aware that even that is arising in your awareness, even the sensation of resistance, even the sensation of contraction. A lot of people experience contractions and they say, oh God, I've got to get rid of this contraction. And to me, it's like, no, there is a bigger space around that contraction. Even that contraction has its place, has its almost, it's a funny word to use here, but right, it has its right to be there because it already is there. It's seen in the bigger ground of awareness. And therefore there's no problem with that there. It's just another arising, another undulation, another taste of life.
Yeah.
Nothing wrong, nothing right, just an aspect of life in that moment.
Yeah, but it's very interesting when you speak about this, because let's say I would have 1 day, 2 days, 3 days in which I would be able to kind of always slide down beneath my experience and just let go and kind of become that open space around my experience. And even if I have moments of unpleasant experience, I would still accept them. And then these 3 days feel like I'm really, really there, really living. And then suddenly a week passes where at the end of it, I feel like it's been one big dream in which I've always identified with this, falling back into, oh no, I'm angry, I am sad, I am anxious. So I'm really curious how for you, you're speaking of this abiding sort of awakening in which maybe do these things occur? Do you still fall back into that dream state of kind of identifying with things, or I'm really curious how it works.
I mean, sometimes experiences that we're going through can be very loud, very present, very intimate, very raw. And they feel like they overwhelm and they take up all the space, all the air in the moment. But what I found was there's always a bigger space. There's always, even subtly, even very, very subtly, the awareness, the space of all of that arising in you. So this, to me, is the abiding that I'm talking about, is that recognition, even very subtly, that you can't even put into words in that moment.
Yeah.
A sense of even okayness, even within that overwhelm. So there's still the bigger picture, I feel, is still present. I think this in and outness, this feeling of like not aware of that space of awareness that you are, is a very usual thing for people to experience along their way, along their path. And it's almost like the repeated recognition and confirmation and sort of falling back into that awareness of awareness in that moment is what comes about. And that can come about in a sudden moment, but more often than not, it's more a repetition or a continual sort of remembrance, until that remembrance is so fundamentally known in the felt experience, in the direct recognition of that moment, that is not lost. Let's say there's no sense of lost, even when there's a moment of complete loudness in life, where it does feel like it's very much all the air is taken up with whatever is happening in the moment.
And when you reach a state where that sort of awareness is abiding, what then? What do you do after that?
Well, it's the whole thing, the whole Buddhist thing of chop wood, carry water, chop wood, carry water. I mean, life is the same. Like, we still, have bills to pay, bodies to look after, relationships to have. Life is, in some ways, very much the same. But the perspective has changed. There's that ground, that background comes to the foreground a little bit more. And it's all playing within that then. And so the whole perspective changes. It adds a thing that was already there in your experience, but you just didn't notice before. And so that in some ways changes nothing, but it changes everything. The life is still the life. We have the four walls, we have it's the same in many ways. And I think people are expecting life to be drastically different. And it's like, no, life is what it is. The perspective of it, and therefore the relationship to it, changes, and can change quite dramatically depending on, if it's been a gradual process, or if it's been quite a shock to the system. It can feel quite dramatic in its way.
Yeah.
But yeah, life is actually, very similar, very same. There are things that change. Certainly when you're not in constant sort of the need of that expectation of life being fulfilled, that conceptual need of what should be going on in life, it doesn't need to be fulfilled in its way. That absolutely does change your relationship to life.
Yeah. This reminds me of a quote by T.S. Eliot in one of his poems. He says that at the end of our searching, we'll arrive back where we started, but we know the place for the first time. So
this is one of my very favorite quotes in
life.
Right? Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And so you mentioned relationships, and I was wondering what role has this played in your path, because it's either relationships with friends or intimate relationships, because there's different views people take, especially on intimate relationships, regarding the spiritual path. Some see them as distractions or, you know, something to be avoided. Others see them as, you know, a manifestation of that, you know, love at the center of it all. So what's been your experience with this?
You know, it's an interesting one because I've been with my husband for 16 years now, and he was an archetypal seeker, and he always, in the start of our relationship, he always sort of had this, it wasn't a threat, but it was this acknowledgement in our relationship that at some point truth was going to come first and he was going to have to go away to his cave. Like that was his, like he made that very clear, that was the most important thing to him in his life, was the search for truth. And I respected that and I loved him for it. But there was always this sort of acknowledgement, and I never had that. I never had that feeling of I had to choose. He had that feeling. And yet in our relationship, I feel that our relationship itself was the catalyst for awakening. It wasn't in spite of the relationship. It was in some ways because of the relationship. Relationships for me provide a mirror. If you see them that way, you can not see them that way, and then maybe that's what other people are talking about them being as a distraction. But if you use those relationships and see them as that mirror of life, that mirror that points back to yourself, and where in yourself there is still some misunderstanding, where there is still some triggers, where there is still something to be seen. Mm-hmm. Those relationships, particularly intimate relationships, but they can come in all forms actually. A relationship between a teacher and a student, a relationship between two friends, a relationship between a stranger on the bus and the bus driver even. They all have the potential to provide, I feel anyway, have the potential to provide a deep mirror if you see it that way. And so for me in our relationship, it has provided such an area of growth for both of us, and in different ways, but it's been really beautiful. And I can't help but feeling that every step of the way, the ability to have that mirror such on close hand, if you were to think of it that way, it meant I couldn't hide from anything, which meant on the other side of it, it got very intense. It can still get very intense. Sometimes you can want to hide from the stuff that you don't want to see, and so then that can create some trouble. But with our relationship, what we've discovered is communication is really the key to that. Open and honest communication about where we're at, not being afraid to double down, and not being afraid to hear what needs to be heard in those moments, having truth as the compass, having love as the compass. Mm-hmm. Love for me isn't some nice, sweet, fluffy thing necessarily. Love comes in so many different forms. Love of the other, for me, comes down to wanting the best for the other. Even if sometimes that best is walking away or whatever it might look like in the moment. Wanting the best for the other, but not compromising that love of yourself as well. It's both. Yeah. And sometimes those can feel like they're in conflict, but if you stick with it, it always deepens down into a deeper understanding of each other, and therefore a more love of each other, actually.
Yeah. When you're talking about a relationship as a mirror, this always reminds me of my brother. I have a younger brother, and he has a very, you can say he's like a hot-headed person. And he has this incredible ability to always find the crack in my facade of calm and like peace and understanding and like really fire me up. And like, he's one of the greatest spiritual teachers I've had, really, because again, he's always there to show like, you're not, you're not really there yet, because there's still this part of you that clings to whatever it is. So, I found
And if the thing is, with your brother, there's a real deep knowing of love there, and with Martin, there's a real deep knowing of and trust of love there. And so even when they are showing you something which you really, every part of your physical being is like, I really don't want to be like, I don't want to hear this, you know. But somehow with love, the truth can be heard. With love, even if there's immense resistance to it, immense sort of denial of it, even, there's, with love, it can be heard somewhere in the heart, it can be heard. And so it doesn't have the same harshness that it can sometimes feel like if there's not that love and trust there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. And yeah, and while we're on this subject, I've been very fortunate in my life to not encounter a great deal of malevolence towards me and other people. So we kind of spoke about the role of suffering, but then there's also something else, which is malevolence, which is kind of the willful creation of suffering. Have you encountered that? And what's your experience? What's your view on this? And how do you deal with it?
Yeah, I have encountered that. I've encountered it a number of times, and I've been not only for me personally, but being very close to that. You know, I used to really struggle with that, and I used to really struggle about how to deal with that. I was a much sort of a people pleaser and a pushover, and so found myself in situations where I could encounter more of that malevolence and not understand why I was encountering that malevolence, and sort of really struggling with that in myself. My perspective of it has changed over the years, and I think it still is in progress of changing, actually. But my sense of it is even malevolence is coming from a place of someone actually wanting to be loved within themselves. And I know that can be a very controversial thing to say. And on the surface level of action, I'm not condoning the action in any way, shape, or form. So for me, it's seeing this in two terms and seeing this in two ways. The surface level and the boundaries that it's necessary for us all to take care of ourselves, and what it requires of us to be loving towards ourselves, which is sometimes a big, strong, fat no. Mm. And taking yourself out of that situation. But I feel that in the same stroke, while that is true, the deeper understanding ultimately has to be recognized that even someone who is acting in ways which we don't condone and we don't want to be around, and we actually want to stop, we want to encourage them to not do that action, or even in extreme cases, you know, you have people literally, you know, taking them out of society or whatever it is when someone's doing something really harmful to a lot of people. But still within that, recognizing that a lot of the reason we do things to others, a lot of the reasons we act in ways that are harmful towards others, is because ourselves, we are struggling with ourselves. We are struggling to come to know ourselves. We're struggling to come to love ourselves, to accept ourselves. I feel that all people in this world are looking ultimately for the same thing, mm-hmm. which is love and acceptance. But due to our sort of family situations, our learnt conditioning, our society, we go about it in ways which often looks like completely the opposite. Because we don't know how to look for that. We don't know how to find that within ourselves. And so we're looking for it in sometimes very, very destructive ways. So for me, it can be both. It actually, there is space for both. It seems like a paradox, but the deep compassion and recognition of why someone is doing what they're doing can be there, while still the recognition of, no, I don't like that. That actually is harmful towards me, or that I'm seeing that you're being harmful towards another. So that understanding, though, has to come from learning what love is myself, mm-hmm. learning what compassion, acceptance is myself. learning what trust of life is myself. You can't sort of know that of the other unless you've learned it of yourself.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. And also, in my experience, sometimes when I see somebody really close to me, when they fall into the trap of, anger and maybe even hatred, and just abandoning themselves to these emotions. And when I observe this, and I know it might be hurtful to me, but then it will quickly pass away. But I know that the most damage that it does is to their own soul, really. So these are really sad moments. These actually remind me of it actually comes up in the Bible a number of times. I don't come from a very religious background, but I've been interested in it. And there's a really strong moment when they, nail Jesus to the cross, and he actually looks up to heaven and asks God, take pity on them. They don't know what they're doing.
Yeah.
So it's like really the people who seem to cause the most destruction in the world, that they really end up getting hurt the most by their actions.
Yeah, they are hurting already. The people that are suffering the most and therefore causing suffering often are the ones that need the most love, and that they are the ones that are the hardest to love.
Yeah.
The ones that are hardest to accept. But again, if you drop deeper into the recognition of maybe where that behavior or that the way they are is coming from, then you can understand that, because you can understand it in yourself. You can understand, what happens when you act in a way that you lash out and you're harmful, and you really, that's not your intention. Or maybe it is your intention because you're in so much pain yourself. So it's very easy to suddenly understand that in another if you can understand it in yourself and accept it. And I feel that, and I was a big one for this, I was avoiding all those aspects of myself, all the potential that I was trying to be the good girl, and so therefore sort of all of that potential of harm and that potential of bad sort of behavioral tendencies was being sort of pushed into the shadow. It didn't mean it wasn't there. It was meaning that I just didn't want to face it. I didn't want to see it. I didn't want to include it into the experience that was Imogen.
Yeah, this is actually really interesting because I've been reading Jung. I'm really interested in his thought, and he speaks of the shadow, which you just mentioned, which is kind of the dump heap where we put everything that we don't want to show to others and to ourselves. But then, he talks about how this place where we dispose of everything we don't want, actually, with time, the more content we put there, it becomes autonomous. It actually can gain a will of its own, and then start to almost be an independent agent in our own lives, so that at some point we have to confront it. And so he would give examples of, sometimes you vent out on somebody, and then a few minutes later you're like, I don't know what came over me. Why did I do this? And this is just this thing coming out of you. So have you had to encounter your own shadow, and what was that process like?
Oh yes. Oh yes. Yeah, I did a lot of work throughout my life on all the positive side of things, and everything was good. And there was this whole shadow that I was almost in complete denial that existed, actually, at certain points. And when that recognition or that awakening occurred, it was like the lid came off of that shadow. And so then I was finding it was seeping into my life in a very dramatic and raw way. There was no ability to resist, or there was no structure to put that back in its shadow, in its box. So yeah, I absolutely had to. I felt like I was having the worst aspects, what I thought were the worst aspects of humanity, marched out in front of my very eyes. And I had to come to terms with every aspect of myself. And when I say every aspect, I'd already come to terms with what we would traditionally call the positive aspects. But I was very much, all of the things that I was trying to hide from myself, I was very unfamiliar with. And so it felt very intense. It felt very unpleasant. There was moments, I remember, I was talking about this with someone the other day. There was moments where I was literally curled up on the floor of my bedroom, post-awakening. This is post-awakening. You know, you think awakening sorts all of this stuff out. Now it does, but not in the way you imagine, for me at least. And so I was having to feel, more importantly than think, but I was having to feel everything coming up, all the things that I didn't want to feel, I was feeling. And it was like life kept putting me in situations where I couldn't hide from myself anymore. I couldn't hide from that shadow. It had to be included in. And, you know, I think of awakening or enlightenment. I like the word enlightenment to break it down, to enlighten. And to me, that was the process. It enlightened it brought light to that shadow. It didn't get rid of it. It didn't need to get rid of it. It just saw it. It saw it for what it was. It brought light to it. It allowed me to bring awareness to all aspects of this embodiment. That's what I would call it. And that's a process that I feel is still happening. I still occasionally hit up into pockets, you know, like you're going along in life. I don't even have to look for them. You know, you're going along in life and you find yourself in a new situation that you haven't found yourself in yet. And there's something, and you go, oh, look, I didn't even see that was there, but there it is. Mm-hmm. And so for me, the process now has become familiar and I trust it. Like I don't ashamed of it or hide from it or I'm in any way avoidant of it, because to me, it's a wisdom. It's a learning and it's a seeing of the wisdom of life. You can't have the light without the shadow. You can't have the shadow without the light. It's just different textures of life. Mm-hmm. And to me, it's nothing to be afraid of. It's nothing to be ashamed of. Is it intense? Those things that you've put in that box and locked away with a key? Yes, very. It can be very intense. But I also have this sense that we don't get what we can't handle as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's very interesting. To me, it sounds like the same way you approach evil and malevolence in the world outside, you use the same language to describe the way you work with the darkness inside of you. So it's kind of the same process.
Because I don't see a difference, actually. That's the truth of it. It's on a different scale. It has a different texture to it, but it's the same. To me, it's what I feel that life is the acceptance of all of it. It's the non-judgment of life in the broadest terms. I mean, obviously you can make distinctions between things and that can be seen as a judgment on a surface level. But in a deeper aspect, the recognition of all of this is life. All of this has its place, has its moment, has its right in a way to life. It is life. And so I don't make those sort of distinctions between life. I just see the different texture of life, rather than judging it to be right or wrong in terms of its fundamental necessity, I guess is the word that's coming up for me in life. Because I feel like if it's arising, if it's happening, it is a necessary aspect of life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Particularly in terms of wisdom. Particularly, like I don't know if I see the lens of life through the wisdom. I see that all of life is wisdom, all of life is growth, all of life is learning. It's not, but that doesn't necessarily equate to comfort, human comfort, our idea of having a comfortable life.
Yeah. It's the more I've kind of looked into it, the more natural it's become for me to see life as essentially teaching. I don't know how you feel about this, but in my life, I've had a few occasions where it's been clear to me that there is some organizing principle that has its own consciousness or will, you can say, which interferes with my life, certainly. So whether you can call it God or fate or whatever, I don't really know. I felt it. And so I had this thought the other day that there's things that you can talk about. Like for example, people who've had psychedelic experiences, they always say, oh, you can't talk about it, you must have the experience. But then people use this language for all kinds of intense experience. But then I think this applies to all experience in life. You can never really talk about something, you can only go through it. And so it makes sense to me that life is essentially, the flow of our life, the flow of our experience is essentially speech, is essentially God's speech, in which God delivers the teaching, which is the wisdom of going through it. So I'm just in the process of thinking about this, but it really gives another richness to life to kind of see it as teaching, as wisdom. And it's very interesting to me that it seems more and more that the teaching is to just let go. In the beginning, it seemed to me like the teaching is you must become this, you must become that, you must order your world in the best possible way. But then it seems more and more to me that it's just about letting go and accepting, like just removing any instance of resistance you can find in your in the way that you encounter the world, which is very, very interesting.
Yeah, I think that there's a deeper wisdom teaching there. I think we are all in different places in our life, and we all, from that perspective, we get what we need in terms of teaching, in terms of wisdom. And for some, it might be a very strong, you need to practice this, you need to meditate, this what you were talking about earlier is like, and then for others, they've been doing that and they come into a place of understanding of, actually there's no one to be practicing this. This is just life moving through me. And so different things, we hear things differently depending on where we're at. And so I think that's why you get lots of different teachers and teachings out there. And, and I feel like some work for people at a certain point and others work for other people at different points. All teachings, however, I feel all of them need to be transcended eventually and let go of. And then we need to stand in our own direct experience of life. But teachings can be helpful pointers, but they're never it.
Yeah.
They can invoke a looking in yourself. And I always encourage whoever I'm working with, I'm like, don't take anything I say for granted. Like, please, everything that I say, measure it back against your own experience. If in that moment what I'm saying doesn't make sense at all to you, fine, let it go, leave it aside. We come at it in a different way then. We go somewhere else. But so it always has to come back to your own direct experience. Otherwise, it's just a load of knowledge that you're collecting in your mind. And that's no use for anyone, I feel, in terms of spiritual awakening. It's great in terms of learning mathematics and, subjects, but it's not in terms of your own recognition of your own ground or your own nature. It's not about learning more. It's about experiencing directly what is being pointed to, either inwardly or outwardly. Those pointings can come from all sorts of directions and from all sorts of sources.
Yeah. There's a beautiful quote from the book of Taoism, in which they say that the man who looks for knowledge must learn something every day, and the man who looks for wisdom must unlearn something every day. Man or woman, that's the language they use. But I really love that quote. And also there's the sense, I don't know who said it, but it's like at some point you have to choose whether you want a PhD in awakening or you want to awaken, which is, again, I think very true.
Yeah. And so, these teachings and pointings, wherever you find yourself, there's many different, ways into that. They are good to a point. But eventually they have to be transcended. They have to be transgressed even. Sometimes you actually literally have to throw them out. Sometimes teachings provide a point of going, no, that's not it even. Mm. When you are recognizing something in your own life that is blossoming, that is opening up, even teachings can provide an opposition to that, and they're teaching you something which actually doesn't feel true in you. And it's like, where is your loyalty in that moment to an idea that someone is putting forth in you, or your direct experience? And I say, just stay open to all of it. But my primary custody, my primary loyalty is to my direct experience, even if that direct experience seemingly puts you in a dead end. To me, even that will teach you something. Even that will give you wisdom. So there's no wrong turns in that way. There's no wrong turns. It might just, your path might feel a little more windy and long-winded, but that's okay too, because that was sort of your destiny to live out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And when you think about life, and actually, I always start my questions, when you think this, when you think that, is thinking the leading, the leading way you interrogate life, or is it feeling, or is it something else entirely?
It's absolutely not thinking. Yeah, I think it's funny because, I'm speaking without any sort of thinking going on. Often I'm like, what happens is it feels like life just is moving through me, and there's all these words coming out, and often I'm as much surprised by what's coming out as the person I'm communicating with. My life is absolutely felt, primarily on the felt level of experience, I feel. And that felt can go from the very gross, obvious, loud feelings to the very, very subtle, energetic, just, you can't even put words to it. So that felt level is to me what I would call the embodiment. It has form to it. It has undulations and textures to it, and that's how we know life. That's how we experience life, is through the felt, I feel. And on top of that is a tiny, if you see it in its right form, is the thoughts, the brain, the mind is a very small part of the experience, actually. It just happens to be a very loud part of the experience.
Yeah. And it has the tendency of wanting to overrule everything you're feeling, so to say.
Yeah, and yet if you see it for what it is, you see it for its, it's a small part of the experience. If you see that, then there's even room for that. There's no need to dampen or reject or fix or get rid of the mind. The mind to me is a beautiful tool. I think the mind has amazing capabilities, but it's very limited. And so it's much more limited, I feel, than the felt experience. But even the felt experience isn't the wholeness of it even. So it's more seeing life with all of the tools that are available to us as this body. But primarily, the mind is not where I look to for most of my experience of life, I'd say.
Yeah. So now I want to ask you something quite practical, which is we spoke about how you've been at a very low point in your life previously, and I'm sure that some of the people who will be watching us will also find themselves in a similar situation. And I've found that it's easy to speak about suffering when you're okay and not suffering. It's very different when you're inside of it. So what helped you? And because I know that you were suffering greatly, even though you were practicing meditation very diligently. So what was it that helped you, and what advice would you give somebody who's greatly suffering?
Yeah. To me, what I did was actually the opposite of what I thought I needed to do. What my brain, what every part of my being was telling me to do was to not go into what I was feeling, to run in the other direction. And when I recognized the futility of that, it was like I couldn't outrun it. It was chasing me. It was sort of on my back. It was there. Whatever was good, we could use an example, anything, fear example, just throwing it out there. It's like there was some sort of fear of something. It's like, and I was suffering that and I couldn't outrun it. For me, what actually helped, and most people, when I say this to people, they sort of look at me like, you're crazy, was turning into it, allowing myself to feel it entirely. Almost like the way I visually sort of see it is almost like a small child coming to a mother and sort of tugging on its clothes and going, hi, I need some attention here. To me, whatever is arising in me, whatever I'm suffering is a call of attention, a call of awareness, a call of love. And so when I was able to turn into it and allow whatever was arising to be there, then I was able to actually transmute it, although that wasn't the intention. You see, if you have the intention of, I want to transform it, I want to transmute it, I want to get rid of my suffering, to me, that is not actually the tender, loving attention, acceptance that is required in that moment. All of our life experience is constantly changing and ebbing and flowing. Even when we feel like say we're suffering from depression, even when we feel like this is never going to end, the thing that makes up this idea of depression has actually got lots of textures to it and lots of different moments to it. And so for me, being able to just be totally present to each and every moment without judgment, without wrongness, without shame, I shouldn't be experiencing this. So the first thing was the acceptance of I am experiencing this. Not in a poor me, pity sort of like, but just in a gentle, loving, this is what I'm experiencing right now. It's calling for my attention. Can I give it my attention? Because everything else hadn't worked, honestly. So acceptance is a big word that I use. And I think it's really misunderstood. A lot of people talk about acceptance, and it's really, oh, well, I'll put up with that. I'll put up with it. I'll accept it. But I'm accepting it so I can get rid of it. But to me, true acceptance is the recognition that this is arising in me, and it's not wrong for arising in me. Yeah. So practically speaking, getting rid of those labels, or at least setting them aside for the moment, any labels, any story about what you're feeling, and allowing yourself to just innocently, tenderly experience it, accept it, bring awareness to it. See that actually it too is arising in you. Allows it to have its space, allows it to be met in its entirety without any sense of wrongness there. And I find that helps generally.
Yeah. And it's essentially a form of self-love, right? It's just using, because love has a great healing power. I very often, whenever, I don't know why, but a lot of my healing, like psychological healing, happens while I'm dreaming. I would sometimes get very vivid dreams. And in a number of them, I experience the same process that you're talking about. So I encounter something in my dream, which is very scary. And then it keeps haunting me, it keeps running after me. And then at some point I make the decision to turn around and embrace it and just show it love. And when I do that, it's always this kind of process of reconciliation and healing, and kind of welcoming back what you've abandoned, something you've wanted to kick out of yourself. And then, yeah.
That's exactly it. And I think that can be a very hard habit to break, honestly. There can be a lot of mistrust of that, because we're taught as pretty young kids, we're taught to not meet and accept and be all of what we traditionally would call these sort of negative sides of experience. So it can be a very hard habit to break, and it can take a lot of patience and a lot of just tender opening to that. It might not happen all at once, right? I'm going to meet this and I'm going to accept this and I'm going to love this. That might not happen all at once. And so the patience is needed to really even love and have patience with that impatience and that sort of that habit and that tendency to do the opposite. But when you do allow yourself to go into that, for me, what was so important was actually just taking note of the actual felt experience when I allowed myself to meet something which I had been trying to outrun, to actually just take note of how that felt in the body. Was there a real, initially it might be a very tight sort of shock to the system, but eventually when you're just tenderly including that, there's a relaxation that happens in the system, and there's an okayness that also happens. And so really taking note of that was very helpful in the learning to trust that process.
That's actually really curious that the language you're using, because this reminds me of some years ago I was reading essentially people who suffer from addiction, like to different substances, and their advice to other people who are healing from addiction, and the advice that they give for when somebody gets an unbearable urge to go back to certain substances is exactly that, to kind of let the feeling kind of come over you and feel it in detail in your in bodily sensations and kind of accept it fully. And it's interesting, they use the exact same language that you're using.
It's for me, we learn through feeling, we learn through the felt experience, we learn more than we can talk ourselves into something. If we feel it and we then trust that experience, there's no talking into it or talking out of it. It is a trust there, and that trust has so much more power than anyone telling you should be doing something or shouldn't be doing something. So for me, taking recourse or taking trust in the felt experience, even how tentative that might be, even if it's the felt experience feels awful in that moment, you can still acknowledge and still understand it more than you can just through conceptual sort of knowledge of it.
Yeah. And also there is another dimension of it, I think, which I learned from meditation actually, because a lot of the teachers that I've had, virtual teachers, they would always give the instructions of, something comes over you, let's say it's anxiety, anger, or boredom, and you just let it evolve in your body and you feel it. And that way you no longer identify with it. You see it as something that's happening inside this sphere of awareness, but it's not you. You're no longer it.
Exactly. It's arising in you. And it's not separate from you, but it's just a part of you. It's almost like, this analogy gets used a lot in spiritual teachings. It's like you're the ocean, but there's a wave there that comes. And so that feeling is a wave. It's still part of the ocean, but it has a distinct sort of footprint. It has a distinct experience to it, more than the silent depth of the ocean. So recognizing that these things are appearing in you, but they're not a separate part of you. They are also part of you, but just a small part of you, a part of you that is constantly changing and evolving and moving and coming and going.
Yeah. And so again, I have to pull Carl Jung into this, because he has a beautiful quote about this. He says that essentially the object that drops no shadow is not real. So it's about this, that for something to be real, it does have a shadow, and for people to be real, we have shadows. And because the world is real, that's why it has its deep shadows. So again, I think that when I read this for the first time, it was really kind of like a blast of lightning, and it helped me be okay with the fact that there are things which don't fit into that image of everything should be light and peace and beauty and songs. There's just another side of life, both outside and inside of us, and it's there, as you say, it has a right of being, and it's there for a reason.
Yeah, it's the way I see it. It's like I love using analogies, and it's like I think of it like you've got a coloring box full of coloring pencils. There's every shade you can imagine in the coloring box, and it would be like taking all of the blues and going, nope, I don't want any blues. And it's like, no, this life is made up of every color you can imagine, every taste, every texture, and for me, we experience all of this, and there can be a joy of experiencing. And to limit yourself to just experiencing, reds, not blues, is to miss part of life, is to miss part of the experiencing of life. To not be afraid of experiencing a certain aspect of what it is to be human in this world. To me, to not be afraid of that is to experience freedom.
Yeah.
To be liberated.
Yeah. And this liberation, again, I don't have a biting awakening, not even close, but I do get glimpses. And these glimpses, with everything that we've just spoken about now considered, essentially boil down to just being in the present and finding it exceptionally beautiful and invigorating in the most an incommunicable way. Like, there's no way to sit with a friend and like explain how I feel. It's the simplest thing. And it's like, previously when I think about awakening, I would imagine myself becoming this exceptionally wise person who always knows the right thing to say and, can heal people by just looking into their eyes. And but it's just something so much quieter. It's like it's not there, but it's like it's everything. So it's
exactly.
very interesting. It's very interesting.
Yeah, it's so ordinary. We miss it. It's actually, awakening is the awakening to your fundamental nature, and you're already that. You literally can't not be that, but you don't necessarily recognize it. And so awakening, you have all these ideas of glamorous sort of spiritual powers and all this stuff, and that stuff can appear too, but that's not awakening to me. That's more life experience, and life experience can come in all forms. But do you recognize that you are the ground of all of those experiences? That's, to me, awakening. That's what the simplicity of awakening is recognizing you're the ground for which all this experience of life happens to and in.
Yeah. And last time we spoke, you told me that after you've had your awakening experience, you started doing things that you hadn't been doing before, like writing poems and writing articles and doing all the work you're doing on your website. And there's this notion, I think, in Zen Buddhism that it's like after you awaken, or you're practicing mindfulness practice, you have to find some sort of outlet, or you don't have to, but it's healthy to find some sort of outlet for this. And maybe you don't even do it consciously, but it naturally happens, in which you just share this with the world. So can you talk a bit more about this?
Yeah, for me, that was the biggest surprise, because I was always quite shy and quite sort of inward and didn't share much or at all of my own inner experience. And it was like a tap that got turned on. And for me, what happened was, like, I don't have ideas about what I should or shouldn't be doing in life anymore. I don't have these like overarching goals and ideals of life. For me, it's the opposite. It's almost like I'm stepping out of the way and letting my hands up and go, okay, life, you move through me, you show me. It becomes much more about being a keen listener or an observer of life, rather than sort of feeling like you have control, or you need to have control, or you need to have ideas and purpose and goals. For me, my purpose, which is what seems to be happening right now, is is more about just listening to where life wants my next footstep to go. And that can be a deep, deep sort of communion with life, a trust of life. And that can take you into very sort of, in terms of the ideas of what life should be, the traditional, happy, successful life. It can take you into paths that you wouldn't ever ask of yourself or want of yourself. I mean, I never thought I'd be doing this kind of stuff in a million years. I still, sometimes I'm like, what the hell am I doing, you know? Because it's what happens when I let life just fully move through me. When there's no brakes on, no handbrake on, no sort of sense of, no, this shouldn't be. It's more about just trusting life. It's more about listening and listening to what life is asking of you in every given moment, and not having any ideas of what life should or shouldn't be for me. And the consequence of that is I found my voice. I say my voice, but actually, again, it feels like it's life's voice. It's like I found life wanting to speak through me very strongly, where it was almost like it was always there, but there was a very tight lid on it. Oh no, I shouldn't be saying things like that. Oh, I shouldn't be talking in that manner. And it's like, no, this is what happens when I just allow life to sort of throw up through me, you know?
Yeah. And then before we started, you mentioned that recently you've had more and more people come to you. So you work with them, you do transmissions, and you consult with them. They consult with you. And so that's basically lots of work. And it does take planning, it does take discipline and so on. So because I face a similar situation because I'm doing the podcast and I'm also working, also doing my blog and so on. And so for me, I'm now much more comfortable with it than I was in the beginning. But I wanted to ask how you approach that fact that from, seeing it from one point of view, you're free, you don't plan, you're spontaneous and you let life happen. But from another, you have to do this today.
Yeah.
So how do you do that?
It's both. It's like it's funny, the mind can't hold these seeming paradoxes in its head. It's like, oh, it's either got to be free or it's got to be planned. The mind is like, cannot handle it when there's these, but actually the heart can handle both of those things. This recognition of life, we have plans, we have sketches, right? Something's in my diary, but I hold it all incredibly lightly because I know that life will happen in the way it happens. And if something gets cancelled or if something switches around or more comes in, and you've got to shuffle things around, I hold all of life very lightly in terms of planning, but it doesn't mean I don't plan. It's both. It's like, I recognize that even the planning is life moving through me too. And so even that becomes the grace of life, I don't see, I get into, talks with people about free will, and I sort of come on the side of there is no free will. There is the appearance of free will, but I don't see that there's actual free will because I can't even make a single thought happen actually.
Yeah.
So how am I in control of all of this? So this is the letting life move through me. Allowing life to move through me sometimes looks like setting plans, writing a schedule, having a whole list of things that need to get done. But the difference is I'm absolutely not attached to that in any real sense. Like there's no like suffering that comes about if something doesn't happen. Like, okay, something gets cancelled. All right, well, it wasn't meant to happen then. So it's both. It's allowing the mind can't hold both of things, but the heart absolutely can. So living from the heart or the soul or consciousness, or whatever word you want to use for it, is really the recognition that life is moving through me. Sometimes that moving through me looks very structured and very, practical and very this, that, the other. And then sometimes it really doesn't look like that at all. And so I just respond to life. I listen to life. I hear what life is wanting of me in every given moment. And I don't sort of sweat it, really.
Yeah. As a side note, what you were just talking about, this actually makes it very much easier arranging things with spiritually awakening people, you know. Speaking from experience with this podcast, like I never feel like, oh, what are they going to think about me if I cancel? You know, one of the my previous guests, Elena Nezinski, we actually joked about it on the podcast. She postponed our conversation like 3 times, and it was okay, you know. So
Yeah.
um, easier when you kind of know that the other person would understand if something comes up.
Yeah, because they understand the nature of life, and the nature of life is wild and unpredictable and spontaneous, and has its structure and has its planning and its way that you can sort of predict some sort of an unfoldment, but it's both. It's absolutely both. And so when you recognize this, that both can coexist and both do arise together sometimes in a very messy way sometimes, you're not resisting that so much, because it's like, okay, well, that's just life. That's what life has to offer in that moment. And you're not, I think it's more about the not having expectations of life, but actually just being open to all possibilities of life.
Yeah. This and you're calling this a paradox, and it really is. And this reminds me, I've had two kind of major online teachers, which is one of them has been Alan Watts, whose major message is the only thing that's a hindrance, that stops you from improving yourself is wanting to improve yourself. And then on the other hand, I've had actually Jordan Peterson, who I know is controversial, but he's really helped me out a lot. And his message is like, you have to have a plan for the next 5 years, next 5 months, and the next 5 days. So, it's very structured. And for a long time, I've been finding both of their messages very, very helpful. And I haven't been able to kind of understand how this is possible. And but then essentially I found that some things are a mystery, and you can never really solve them. You can only kind of plunge into them and accept them for what they are.
Yeah.
So
this is living from the heart for me, and it's more about seeing what happens, being curious. It's like this question of what will I do next is not about I've got to do something next. It's a genuine childlike curiosity of like, I'm really curious as to what will happen next. Now I've set this plan in motion, but I don't know if that plan is actually going to come off. I don't know if that's actually going to happen. Now, if I don't have any attachment to the outcome of that plan, then that is totally fine. It's like, oh, something else has happened. And then it becomes that curious childlike play of like, well, I'm curious now what this will happen. This will turn into. So for me, you can have both of those things in your life as long as there's not attachment to either of them.
Yeah. And again, this lack of attachment is I think the path to spontaneity. Like there's all these tales in the Buddhist sutras of how the Buddha was so spontaneous. He always knew the right thing to say. And one explanation of how that was possible is that, when you're not attached to anything, what comes out of you is what would come out of the moment naturally. When you don't approach a situation with a certain, opinion or point of view or a certain angle, you just approach it for what it is.
That's exactly it. And that, to me, there is no other way of life that I can live right now. And there's nothing else that makes sense, because I've seen the suffering in every other possibility that I've experienced. So for me, this is the only thing that not even on an intellectual, but also on an intellectual level, the only thing on the felt level that absolutely makes sense is to not have expectations of life. I only find suffering in expectations. You can hold an idea of maybe this is what will happen, but holding an expectation is something very different.
Yeah. And then again, this is all kind of recognizing that other thing which you said, which is, different people need different lessons in their lives. So for example, some people like Nietzsche, his famous words were, a life is suffering, and, surviving is finding meaning in the suffering. So that's sort of approach is, embrace the suffering and kind of hold on to your attachments and expectations. And I think certain people, all people in certain ways can learn in some way from that. Like I've learned from that approach at some point. I no longer really adhere to it, but yeah, I think there's also, but again, you mentioned this kind of recognizing that there's different things for different people at different times.
Yeah, I feel like we are uniquely walking our own path. There are no two paths that are exactly the same. And if you recognize that, you relax into your path of life. And also you recognize that you can't go wrong with your path of life. You might find yourself in a difficult situation or a place of deep suffering, but it's what you kind of had to go through in that moment to learn the lesson. You may not see it in that moment, but in your lifelong living, you may see why you had to go through that. And if you need to, like what you're saying, is like if you actually need to go into the suffering and the attachment and all of that, even that I think is another form of acceptance, actually, which is what I'm talking about. A lot of the things I'm talking about is acceptance. So even the acceptance of non-acceptance to me is still acceptance.
Yeah. Yeah.
And has deep wisdom in it. So if that's the best you've got in that moment, the meta acceptance of life, it's like that thing of like, I accept that I'm not okay. Yeah. And even that has some space around it. Even that has some wisdom to it. Even that has some freedom to it, actually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's a very famous story of a person going to the Buddha, and he has a poisonous arrow. Do you know this one? A poisonous arrow. So a person has been struck with a poisonous arrow, and oh no, sorry, I'm telling the story wrong. So a person goes to the Buddha. He's not struck with an arrow or anything, and then he starts asking the Buddha, so what's the nature of the cosmos? Where do we come from? Where are we going? What's the purpose of life? And all these big questions. And then the Buddha tells him this story, that if a man is struck by a poisonous arrow, he doesn't come to you and ask, what's the make of the arrow? Who shot it at me? Like, what country does it come from? Where was it produced? He just wants the arrow out of his body. So I really admire kind of the purity of your message, because not once have you made any metaphysical claim, like in our entire conversation, which is like very refreshing and is very beautiful to encounter. Once you mentioned free will, but I don't think that's a metaphysical question. I agree with you. Sam Harris, one of his, when he talks about free will, he's like, name a movie, and you name a movie, and he asks you, why did you name this particular movie? Did you see all the movies you've ever heard of and like select one purposefully, or did it just pop up in your mind?
There you go.
And yeah,
it's a very practical thing for me. The discussion of free will, it comes down to a very, very practical application of like, well, okay, let's just look at life. Yeah. How is life working? I get that there's an appearance of free will and there's an idea of free will, but when you have a decision to make between A and B, how do you make that decision? A bunch of thoughts pop up about A, a bunch of thoughts pop up about B, and you might feel like you're making a decision, but even where did those thoughts come from? Where's the sense coming? I feel like A, or all of these positive thoughts about A are coming, and all these negative thoughts about B are coming, but where did even those come from? And so without sort of going into it too much, but I think when you start to observe your life without assumptions, it seems like a natural conclusion to me. Yeah.
No, to me as well. And at the same time, this is recognizing the fact that, our civilization, our society, the way we structure it, really kind of hangs on to this, recognition of free will. And I think you can still live with that and know that on a fundamental level, it's not there.
It's both. Again, it's the paradox. It's the fact is, and this is why I say the appearance of free will. We act in this world It would be like, to change tack, it would be like knowing that you're in a dream, but still knowing it's a dream, like knowing you're in a dream and acting and playing out in the dream and making decisions in the dream, but knowing fundamentally deep down, I'm in a dream. So it's the same sort of thing. It's like we act with as if we have free will, because even that is what is spontaneously arising within us. Yeah. The desire and the to make decisions and go left, not right, feels like free will. But just because something feels, or the appearance of free will, doesn't mean fundamentally, when you get down right to the bottom of everything, that there truly is free will.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and I want to ask you, actually, when I told you that story about the Buddha, I wanted to ask you whether you entertain any speculations about, the ultimate nature of reality or kind of purpose of life or whatever, or do you resist going in that direction, or how do you think about these things?
I do think about these things, but generally the conclusion I keep coming to is I don't know anything. Like I can come up with ideas in the mind. Sometimes there are ideas in the mind about the nature of purpose and things like that. And this is something that I'm definitely, I feel, exploring more and more. But I always come down to this feeling of I don't know anything. I actually don't know anything of life. Like I sound like I know what I'm talking about sometimes, but my direct experiences is I don't actually know. I don't think I need to know though either. There's a lot to life that is beyond the comprehension of the human mind, I feel, or at least my human mind. I don't want to speak for others, but and yet here I am living life, and that to me feels like a miracle a lot. It feels like a really wonderful experience of life that I get to live life, and yet I don't need to know how to live life.
Yeah.
So yeah, these things do come up, these contemplations do come up, but ultimately I always come back to it doesn't really matter. Mm-hmm. I'm just present for life in this moment, and that seems to be the most tangible and real thing is this moment as it is. Everything else, I leave room for all possibilities, but I also don't feel I need to know all possibilities.
Yeah. It's wonderful talking to you. I don't want to hold you for too much longer, but for people who've stuck all the way to here, would you like to just tell a bit more about the things that you do and where people can find out more about you and what things you have planned for the future?
Yeah, so my website is beyondimogen.com, and that's pretty much a hub of everything if you want to find out about me. I do one-on-one sessions with people, which traditionally is a mixture of I guess guidance, or I call it mentoring, and then there's a divine light transmission at the end. I also do a lot of group meetings, several a week, a lot of like 30-minute quick ones, and all of that can be found on my events page.
Yeah.
And I've been doing retreats, and I've actually really loved the format of retreats. I've got one coming up at the end of September, and it's a slightly longer one, 5 days online. And there's something about the container of a retreat which I find really special, and allows to go very deep. The way I approach retreats is mostly a lot of divine light transmission. So it's sort of doing the work on a different level, on an energetic level. And then we have a few sessions where people can talk and share and ask questions or whatever is coming up for them. Yeah. So I really enjoy the retreats. But yeah, beyondimogen.com is really, you can find anything you want. I have a WhatsApp group as well that allows people to get a real-time notification of what I'm doing.
Yeah.
But again, all the information is on the website.
Yeah, and I've personally experienced one of your shorter transmission sessions, and again, it was a really, really positive experience for me. And so I guess for people who don't know what it is, my personal experience, what I was doing, I was just meditating, and you were there doing the transmission, even though I don't really know what it is, but it felt very positive. It felt healing. So how do you do the retreat online? What happens?
So it's essentially several Zoom calls over the course of a day, and I try and space it out so that everyone can sort of attend depending on their time zones. Essentially, it's like every few hours there's another divine light transmission that I do. And then at the beginning, I'll give guide. I encourage people to put down their lives during the retreat and actually take the opportunity to do a sort of a home silent retreat. I mean, obviously, in this day and age, doing a physical retreat isn't so possible right now. So the online ones, I started. My first was in April, I think, and or May actually, and yeah, I just think they're a really nice opportunity to really immerse yourself in yourself. Actually, is how I look at it, and I do that mostly the divine light transmission. And meditation is the format, but again, the speaking, those sessions where we speak is also an important factor of it, because it can remove a little sort of a thorn in your side that is a little misunderstanding or assumption or a question or doubt or something like that. So that I think they support each other very nicely.